Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, making sense of the Old Testament for the church. I'm Matthew Delaney here with Dr. Nathan French, and today our special guest is Dr. Todd Hibbard. Really excited to have him. Todd Hibbard is a professor and chair of religious studies at the University of Detroit Mercy. He has a PhD in Christianity and Judaism and Antiquity from the University of Notre Dame. And today we're going to have a conversation that's inspired by one of his books, Prophets and Prophecy: Ancient Israel and Judah. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure thing. Great to be here.
So, first question I always love to ask our guests because I
Mhm.
just find it interesting is kind of how did you get into biblical studies and what's your
Yeah.
passion within the field? Obviously, before we were here recording, you teach a lot of courses. What's kind of your passion these days? And also, just tell us a little bit about your publication, Prophets and Prophecy.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, again, thanks for inviting me to be with you. I'm looking forward to the
Mm.
conversation. I got into biblical studies sort of through the back door, I guess. Like I suppose a lot of folks, I was a kid who grew up in the church. My father was a minister, and so grew up hearing Bible stories and all of that sort of stuff, and hearing these sorts of things. But I really grew to have a passion for history. And so I think it was
Mm.
really, of all things, history that kind of led me into this. And then when I got into college, after changing my major a couple of times, I wound up as a theology major and really found that I loved ancient languages. And so it was really ancient history and ancient languages that kind of led me to first to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and then I said backdoor into the prophets because I took a course. I was maybe a sophomore or a junior. I took a course in the prophetic literature, and it was really transformative. It was a way of thinking about the prophets I had never really encountered before, thinking about the prophets against the backdrop of ancient imperial, historical context and so on and so forth. And it that really just sort of lit a passion for me, and
Mm.
led me then to study of other ancient Near Eastern languages and so on and so forth. And so back, I kind of made it that way into prophets in the Old Testament that way. Once I got into it, the I would say the more niche area that has been of interest to me and has really kind of defined my publication life, if only accidentally, has been the book of Isaiah. I
Mm.
wrote my dissertation on Isaiah and published on Isaiah, and really intended to move on to other things. And one thing leads to another. You do a little writing on it, then you get asked to do a few more things, and it turns out 25 years later, I've spent my life more or less doing Isaiah. So I didn't intend to do that, but I'm certainly not unhappy that that's the way it's worked out, because I find Isaiah a kind of endlessly fascinating book. And so that's
Yeah.
sort of my little niche part of the prophetic literature. The book itself, the Prophets and Prophecy book, grew out of teaching a course on the prophetic literature and prophets in ancient Israel for many years. And there's a lot of really good things out there, most of which deal with the prophetic literature as literature, theological literature. And that's great. That's the way the pendulum in our field has swung over the last 30 or 40 years. And I think that's great. I found that many of my students kept asking me, though, about kind of historical issues
Yeah.
related to the prophets. And often the things I was having them read didn't really treat those things.
Mm.
And and so I thought, if I ever have an opportunity to write a kind of intro book for a course like this, I really want to offer something that is uh, really more rooted on the historical side of things, which I understand is really problematic. But I
Mhm.
thought if there's a way to kind of thread the needle and talk about that, I think students would find that valuable. Anyway, fast forward a few years, and Paulist Press, with whom I published this, one of their editors, who's a friend, said, "Hey, would you consider publishing something with us? And if so, what would you do?" And I said, "Well, it's sort of funny you ask. Here's the thing I've been kind of chewing on for the last several years." And he said, "Yeah, I think that'd be great." And so set about writing that, and so that's how the book sort of came about. We landed on the word phenomenology. If people look at the book, we talk about it as a phenomenology, or the phenomena of prophecy, as a way of recognizing that I am trying to do something that is more rooted and grounded in history, but not straightforward history in a kind of
Mm,
uncritical sense.
yeah.
And we can talk about that if you'd like.
Mhm.
But that's sort of the genesis of the book, and sort of related to my own scholarly pursuits.
Of course. Well, we're looking to dive in deeper into some of these topics from your
Sure.
book
Yeah.
and in your research. I think the prophets are definitely a part of the biblical literature that get a lot of questions
Hmm.
or some odd avoidance, right? Because it
Hmm.
can feel like difficult. How do I get into it? But I know
Right.
there's so much gold here, and I want to
Yeah.
learn more.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate the straightforwardness of your book and the conciseness with it. And I think the historical approach really helps ground things too, right? We're
Hmm.
meeting real people with real lives and real places. So I really appreciate that you
Well,
went from
thanks.
this person who loved history to you know
Yeah.
by the way, welcome to the club. I loved
Right.
dinosaurs growing up as a kid. I mean, I feel like all of us
Of
started with
course.
some ancient
Well,
history and we found our
yeah.
way into biblical studies, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
Um, I'd love to just ask, one question that immediately comes to my mind, I think is probably the most common thing I run into when we're talking about prophets and prophecy. And I'm sure those who are listening, right, maybe they relate to this question, or if they're interacting with others, this comes up quite often is, well, what do prophets do? And
Mm.
the first answer that feels obvious is, well, they prophesy.
Right.
Duh, right?
Right.
Um, and what does prophesy mean? Well, it means to tell the future. And I wonder if you can just begin maybe just an initial response to how do we approach this when we look at the Bible portraying prophets acting in a variety of ways. Maybe you can just give
Mm.
us just a little overview of some of the diversity of what
Yeah.
prophets in the Bible do.
No, that's a great question, and it's a question I get asked all the time. What do they do? And I often respond that way. They prophesy, and then the question, of course, is, well, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah.
And part of what I was trying to do in this book is to introduce and unpack at least a little bit the wide variety of prophetic activities
Mm,
that we find represented in the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible, but also throughout the ancient Near East. That they're not sui generis. These are not individuals who are doing something that is entirely unknown in the rest of the ancient Near Eastern world either. And so when you start looking at the Hebrew Bible, one of the things you notice is that prophets do a whole lot of things, and part of that is dependent on which authors are telling you what they do. Um, but part of it, I think, is baked into the recognition that prophets in ancient Israel and ancient Judah wore a lot of different hats. They did a lot
mm,
of different things um, over a long period of time. And so they behave in certain ways, they say certain things, um, they don't say certain things, they don't behave in certain ways, and so on and so forth. So in the book, I begin kind of exploring some of the roles that they take on. So I talk about, for example, prophets as royal advisors. And one of the things when I took that class I mentioned earlier in my college days about prophets, I was struck by how often I understood prophets as engaging in straightforward kind of political and foreign policy advice. Talking to the king and saying, "Look, here's what you ought to
mhm.
do in this situation. Here's what you shouldn't do in this situation.
Yeah.
And you want to be successful, do what I'm telling you to do." In the way that we might think of sort of public intellectuals today, who
Mm.
who might write an op-ed in the New York Times or something like that,
Yeah.
and who are trying to speak to the political powers and saying, these are things you ought to do. So they're royal advisors, but that also extended even to um, uh, uh, anointing kings, bringing kings to the
Yeah.
throne. So you don't have kings coming to the throne in some authorial context without prophetic involvement. So
Mm.
that was one of the things that I wanted to get into. I also then talked about how, in some other contexts, what we find are prophets engaged in kind of miraculous and ecstatic behaviors,
Yeah.
performing miracles in the way that other cultures might associate with shamans or individuals like that, which is a very different kind of profile than someone standing in front of a king offering them advice on how they ought to deal with the kingdom of Moab. Right, that's a very different
Mm.
kind of profile. And then there's another set of texts in which we find prophets very much involved in cultic activities, that is, worship activities,
Mm,
either as supporters of those activities or as critics of what they think are some of those cultic activities that have gone awry and that sort of thing. And then, of course, I think one of the ways that prophets are perhaps most well known is when they put on the hat of social, economic, and legal critic. And so I've got a chapter in the book in which I kind of begin to unpack some of that as well. And in those cases, I think you find prophets as what I would think of as traditionalists, social traditionalists. They're very much on the side of people who have been part of society, have experienced society in a particular way, and in that sense, they don't want to change. They want society to
mm,
be as it has been because that's the way it was ordained by God. And anybody who wants to kind of mess around with that should be viewed with some suspicion. And I think one of the ways you see that is when they start talking about economic and legal matters. Um, and then the last thing I wanted to deal with in the book, which I think is often neglected, is really this understanding of the literary activity that resulted in prophetic books as
yeah,
itself a prophetic activity.
yeah,
Mm.
I think in our field,
that's
there
very
has been
helpful.
a tendency to kind of separate those things and to
Mm,
treat literary activity as a scribal phenomenon.
mhm,
And I
Mm.
don't have any particular qualms with that. Clearly, there are scribes that are involved in this activity. But I also think there's a way to think about scribal activities that create prophetic literature as itself a sort of prophetic activity
mm, yeah,
from within their particular perspective.
mm,
And so, in that sense, I part of what I was trying to do was say, we can bridge the gap that I think sometimes is thought to exist between these two sets of activities. So that's just a bit of the varieties of prophetic activities that I began to think about, largely in response to things that students were saying to me in the classroom. And so I thought,
mm,
well, let's write a book in which we begin to kind of unpack some of that. And so once you start doing that, the idea of prophesying, as in predicting the future, sort of gets contextualized in a very different kind of way.
yeah, yeah,
I tell my students all the time, yeah, prophets predict the future, but it's really about like tomorrow. you know do this thing, or tomorrow there's going to be a problem, or
mm,
5 o'clock today there's going to be a problem if you don't do this
mm,
this sort of thing I want you to do. So not that it doesn't happen, but it happens, I think, for the most part, in very different kinds of ways than students and readers often think.
Before Nathan asks our next question, I have to give a quick response. To me, the way I feel hearing you talk is this is exciting. Like this
Yeah.
diversity
yeah,
is so
Mhm.
interesting. Like it
Yeah.
just it's not like, oh, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, and so on. It's just like it's a bunch of the same,
Mhm.
right? It's like
Mhm.
no, like look at and that's not even including the ones in many of these narrative books, right? That
Right.
you also go into. To me, this makes this world all that more interesting.
Mhm.
So anyway,
Well,
I
thank you.
think that's something that should excite people. And your book, of course, is a great intro into that, right? Like let's kind of
yeah,
break it down.
yeah.
Good.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with all of that. I think you've definitely accomplished that in this book in a really, really superb way, and I absolutely love too that we don't just have one picture of the prophet, which we often have sometimes within our preaching, within our circles, sometimes within our academic circles as well. But that there's such a multifaceted aspect to this office,
Mhm.
both in the Hebrew scriptures, but then to place it within history itself to see that other cultures have prophets as well that
Mhm.
are acting in similar ways. I find my students always are just sort of awakened to that. Like, well, I had
Mhm.
no idea that that was a
Mhm.
real thing, that this was a real office. So I think you've accomplished that. It's kind of this book I've always been looking for, I guess, for an intro to prophets. So
Good.
really like it for that reason. So you've talked about this a little bit. You were talking about phenomenology. So my question really takes us back to there. Um, so can you explain what you mean by a phenomenological study of these
Yeah.
texts and how it relates to historical and literary questions about the prophets?
Yeah, so thank you. That's a good question. So I should begin this by saying the early title for this book was actually going to be a phenomenology of prophets.
Ah,
And we ditched that for a couple of reasons, mostly because, of course, phenomenology is its own
right.
discipline. And,
Yeah.
and I was not doing that. So I have a very close colleague in philosophy here in the university who does phenomenology. And I was
Hmm.
talking to him about this book one day, and he said, you're not doing actual phenomenology, so be careful about using
Exactly.
that
Right.
word. And I said, no, you're right. I didn't mean it in the very technical sense. So
Hmm.
we dropped the word, although I did keep phenomena. So that's the
Yeah.
way I'm sort of weaving that in there. And I'm thinking about that. In the first chapter, the introductory chapter, I try to get into this. What I'm trying to do is to use phenomena as a way to the way I put this earlier was to kind of thread the needle between a strictly literary approach to the
Yeah.
prophets, and one that is overly historical in
Hmm.
that it attempts to read every text about prophets in the Hebrew Bible as a historical event. I'm not
Yeah.
trying to do that.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to do was say, yeah, we do have historical people, events, occurrences in ancient Israel and Judah that involve prophets. The degree to which we can access any one of those in its particulars in the Hebrew Bible, of course, is always an open question because the texts
Mm.
have to be read critically. On the other hand, I didn't. I felt myself having some dissatisfaction with approaches that said, "Well, these are just literary portrayals."
Yeah.
Um, and my dissatisfaction was this: there was, I think, sort of tacit. There is tacit within some of those approaches a way of saying, "Yeah, that's literary, and it probably is not connected with actual prophecy or prophetic activity." And my argument was, even if we think of these as literary, I'll even use the word creations, there has to be a certain kind of verisimilitude in them that
Mm.
made what they were portraying ring true.
Mm.
So that in that sense, we have access to the historical phenomena of prophecy, even if in any particular text, it's only a literary formulation of that.
Mm. Yeah.
So I spend when I teach this stuff, I spend the first couple 2-3 class periods going through what that looks like with students to kind of help them see what I'm getting at. In the book, I use Jeremiah 36 as just an example.
Mm.
Jeremiah 36, is this very famous text where Jeremiah dictates a scroll to Baruch, who then takes it to King Jehoiakim. And it's got lots of invective apparently for Jehoiakim. We're never really told what's on the scroll, but we can tell from Jehoiakim's response that he's displeased.
He
To put
doesn't
it
like it.
mildly, yeah,
Yeah.
he burns it, throws it in the fire, and so on and so forth. After which, of course, Jeremiah dictates another with one of my favorite lines of the prophetic literature, with additional comments. I've often imagined that as some special little Jeremianic words just for Jehoiakim. So the question is, well, is that a historical event? To which, my honest answer is, well, maybe, maybe not. But what we've got in Jeremiah 36 is a literary representation that is shot
Mm.
through with theological ideas and implications and so on and so forth. However, that doesn't mean that that theologically inflected narrative portrait doesn't actually give us access to a phenomenon of prophecy, the way
Mm.
prophetic texts came about, prophetic scrolls.
Mm.
And we can verify this by, just looking, for example, at some of the um, uh, other ancient Near Eastern texts that report how scribes were involved in the creation
Right.
of prophetic scrolls and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
it's a way of saying, I don't necessarily have to say to students, every every little thing in Jeremiah 36 played out exactly the way that it did. But in offering that little qualifier, I can also say it's still a text that gives us a window into, in this case, the literary creation of a prophetic scroll
Mm.
that is
Yeah.
a prophetic activity. And so it opens a window into the wider phenomenon of, in this case, prophetic, the creation of prophetic scrolls, which I'm in this book saying is part of the prophetic activities. So what I was trying to do was kind of hit that, kind of hit that middle ground between those two.
Mm.
Whether I've actually accomplished that or not, I guess is for others to say. But that's really what I'm getting at with phenomena. So I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
mean to suggest that we can write a history of prophecy that looks at every particular text, every particular narrative sequence in the Hebrew Bible, and say, this is historically exactly what happened in all of these contexts. That would be, I think, naive. But I do think these texts do give us a window into what prophecy was, what prophets did, and how it functioned.
Yeah.
And so that's really kind of what I was going for.
Excellent. Yeah, very good. It reminded me when I was reading your book of another text that I loved when I was writing my dissertation by Anne Marie Kitts called "Cursed Are You!" exclamation mark, a
Right.
phenomenological study of curses in biblical in Hebrew and Akkadian texts, I think
Yeah.
is what it was.
Right.
Yeah, it's very similar because it in one sense you are just looking at the literature that's been left to us, the literary
Mhm.
text that we have, but you do get a sense that I am encountering the phenomena of the past in the sense that
Mhm.
I'm seeing a window into the culture that I wouldn't otherwise see,
Right.
and to see it so widespread across various texts
Mhm.
assumes that there is something there as far as the shared cultural norms or the way that they're thinking about these things. So
That's right, shared cultural norms. But the other thing I would add to that, though, is, and this gets back to Matthew's question a minute ago, also the diversity of these kind of
correct. Yes,
perspectives of what
exactly.
they think, right? So,
Hmm.
you know, the authors of the so-called Deuteronomistic literature have a
Hmm.
very particular
Yeah.
understanding of what the phenomenon of prophecy would be, which in many ways you might say is differs from, I don't know, pick somebody, Amos. I wouldn't want to drive too sharp of a
Ezekiel.
wedge. Ezekiel,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. Ezekiel
Yeah.
could be a
Right.
better case in point.
Yeah.
Or the other way I do that is, I'll pit, after we do Isaiah, we'll talk about how there are certain texts in Jeremiah that are responding to some of the traditions in Isaiah, I think, as if to
Yeah.
say, that may have worked in the 8th century, but now down here in the 7th and early 6th century, it's a
Yeah.
different phenomena. And so that means there's a certain elasticity and variability in
Mm.
what you find in prophecy and the way that phenomena is understood.
That's good. That's good. And you really do point that out in the book now that you say it like that, because I remember reading that and going back thinking, oh, that's a great way to sort of pit a prophet against a prophet,
Mhm.
as far as the literature is concerned, and show us a lot of the differences that we have. So on that point,
Mhm.
w- let's move then on this next question. So how similar or different are prophets, let's say, of ancient Israel and Judah in comparison to other prophets in the Near East? So
Yeah.
maybe just give us a breakdown of that. You've done it a little bit, but maybe more specific
Yeah.
with this. So
Yeah. So I'll begin by saying prophets in the ancient Near East, and this is the way I introduce them to my students. Prophets in the ancient Near East are much more pro-monarchy,
mm,
generally speaking, than the prophets of the Hebrew Bible.
yeah,
If you look through, that standard little collection that was it Martin Nisanen did the translations of the text.
mm,
If you just skim through some of those, um, there you often find prophetic oracles that are supporting the king's reign, and may Ishtar bless the king's reign, and so on and so forth. So that's one way in which they're different. I think for the most part, prophets in the and here I'm thinking primarily of the Mari archives and the
yeah,
Neo-Assyrian archives are much more pro monarchy. I think
mm,
part of that may be because many of these prophets are probably much are probably on the royal payroll, And
I
so,
was gonna say they're making a good living, aren't
yeah,
they?
and
Yeah.
so you don't cut off your nose to spite your face, as it were, when you're in that situation. So I think that's part of it. The other thing I would say, though, is that as another way in which they're somewhat different, prophecy in the ancient Near East does not give rise to the same kind of literature that we have in the
Mm,
Hebrew Bible.
that's
So
yeah,
it's only in the Hebrew Bible that we get prophetic literature.
yeah.
So we do have, some smaller collections of prophetic oracles that develop, particularly in the Neo-Assyrian tradition, but nothing that looks like wholesale prophetic
Mhm,
literature like you get in a book like Isaiah, for example.
mm,
There's nothing quite like that. So that's another way in which I think they're different. And one upshot of that is the prophetic literature, such as it is in the ancient Near East, is much shorter generally than what we
yeah.
have. These oracles tend to be short, relatively speaking. So that's another way in which they differ. One way I think that they're more similar than is often sometimes recognized is I think both sets of prophets uh, were much more associated with um, temples and sanctuaries than is often recognized. That's certainly
That's good.
clear in the ancient Near East.
Yeah.
There's no question about this, right? Prophets often do their thing from within temples. One of the things that I really think, in fact, if I were going to rewrite sections of this book, I might actually bring this out even a little more. I think the prophets in the Hebrew Bible are even more closely connected to the Jerusalem temple or other sanctuaries and shrines than is often recognized. Not to say that people don't recognize that, they do.
Sure, sure.
Isaiah, again,
Yeah.
a great case in point. So I think that's another way in which they are very closely connected. That there's this recognition that the locale for prophetic activity is the temple or the
Yeah.
sanctuary. And that's, if you just stop and think about that, that makes sense. That's because, well, that's where the deity resides. That's where the deity makes
Mhm.
the deity's presence known. So if a prophet is going to speak on behalf of a deity, it makes sense that would be the case. One last difference I'll just point to, and there are many more that could be said, is I think on this question of social and legal critics, the prophets of the Hebrew Bible sort of chart territory that we don't really find uh, much of in ancient Near Eastern
Mm,
prophecy. We do find a little bit of it, but not much. And often when prophets in the ancient Near East are complaining about economic injustice, it's because they haven't been paid for their own prophetic activities. So, I
yeah,
did this
right.
thing for you, and oh, by the way, I'm still waiting on my, 3 jugs of wine and sheep.
Yeah.
So you think you could send some my way? So that's the kind of economic abuse they point to. Whereas the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, I think, are much more interested in societal and political and abuses of one sort or
Yeah.
another.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue because
Yeah.
when I was thinking about how to do an interview about all the prophets, there's just so much to talk about. It's
Yeah.
all exciting. I just found myself particularly compelled by your section on talking about prophets as economic and legal critics. I'd love to spend a little bit of time diving a little bit deep into this. And I want to start actually from a quote from your book that was particularly jumped out at me. On page 140, you say, nothing is more uniquely characteristic of the phenomenon of prophecy in ancient Israel and Judah than the subject matter of this chapter, prophets as social critics. End quote. I think many people would find this to be a fascinating idea. Can you introduce why this is such a critical concept for understanding biblical prophets?
Yeah, good. Well, thanks for pointing that out. And I will say there's a reason I waited to get to that until late in the book. Uh, um, but anyway, we can maybe talk about that later. But yeah, I do really think that is one of the things that makes the prophets of ancient Israel and Judah unique, and in part because I don't think you see a lot of this in the prophets of other ancient Near Eastern cultures. But the other thing is because it's ubiquitous throughout
Mm,
the text of the prophetic portion of the canon. I mean, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
So I mean, I would argue you find some version of this in every prophetic book and in many of the narrative traditions about the prophets. This is one of the things with which they are connected. And I think this goes back to something I said before, and that is, I think many of these prophets are spokespersons for a traditionalist kind of society. And that puts them very often on the side of small villages, villagers, and
Yeah.
farmers in this agrarian, largely subsistence society,
Mm.
and allows them to offer messages of critique to the monarchy, because it was the monarchy in many ways that recognized, or that represented the most significant threat to that kind of society.
Mm.
In part because of things like tribute and taxes
Yeah.
that ancient Israel and Judah found themselves having to pay to their imperial overlords. And of course, where does that come from? That's going to come from, among other places, some of these smaller farms and villages and so on and so forth. And so it undoubtedly created economic pressures on these um, families who had lived for generations in these villages, in these farms, and whose way of life, I think, was understood by many of these prophets as a way that was ordained by God.
Mm.
That Yahweh had brought them into the land, had given them these land holdings, and this way of life is the way we ought to live. And anything that poses a threat to that is something that the prophets view as a significant challenge to a divinely ordered society, if I can put it
Mm.
in that way. So to the extent that the monarchy encroaches on that, well, that's a threat. That's a danger. And I think even in a case like Isaiah, a prophet that a prophetic book that is very much, some people think, closely aligned with the monarchy in certain respects. One can find texts in which the prophet speaks very harshly about the encroachment of the monarchy or elites associated with the monarchy on that traditionalist way of life. The thing of Isaiah 10, right, which begins with that oracle denouncing those who create, I'm paraphrasing here, that create statutes and laws that make it legal for elites and the monarchy to expropriate property that doesn't belong
Yeah.
to them, right? That's just one example, but you could find all kinds of examples like that in other places. The other way I get at this with my students is to just take them through the sheer number of times the prophets talk about and use the language of poor, needy, I mean, it's all over the prophetic literature. And it shows that the prophets are often um, giving voice to those who otherwise don't have a voice.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It,
and so, yeah, that's part of where that's coming from.
mm. Well, I was going to say it's interesting how much that it really is connected to the Torah too, isn't it?
Mhm.
To see the Israelites as slaves being brought out,
Mhm.
and that the divinely ordered society is one in which even Yahweh is going to give land to His people, right? And
Right.
you see that reaching all the way out. So it's really interesting that you're picking up on that. So on this economics point, this question here I think would be really good. Could you paint us a picture for how economics functioned in the first millennium?
Mm.
In Israel and Judah, as well as maybe sources from which that understanding comes.
Yeah, yeah. So in the book, I'll deal with the second question first, the sources. In the book, I look at texts from the Hebrew Bible and some non-biblical texts as well. But then I also look at two other ways of thinking about this. One is archaeology. I think
Mm.
archaeology is a great resource for understanding economic reality in the first millennium. And biblical scholars are um, more or less comfortable dealing with archaeology because it's its own it's its own way, has its own way of dealing with matters. But I think archaeology tells us a lot. Luxury goods, in particular, when you find
Yeah.
luxury goods, or wine presses, those sorts of things, tell us a lot about economic life. And then the third thing that I use in the book, which maybe not everybody would agree with, is some social scientific modeling. So I think economics is a field in the social sciences, and so one of the things I think that we have to think about when we start talking about what economics looked like in any society, whether it's the first millennium or the medieval period or whenever, is you have to think about structures and what do those structures look like, because economic activity and behaviors tend to play out in very structured contexts and in very structured ways. So that's something about sources. On your question about painting a picture in the first millennium, again, I would always begin by saying, ancient Israel and Judah were, for the most part, agrarian societies. So
Yeah.
even if you recognize that they have monarchies, these are agrarian societies with monarchies that are sort of layered on top of that. But those monarchies, at least in the first half of the first millennium, well, no longer than that, the first, 700 years, existed as monarchies that were themselves secondary to larger imperial structures.
Yeah.
So
Right.
they were monarchies that existed as part of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire. And so it meant that they didn't function as monarchies that had sort of an unfettered control over
Yeah.
their own
Autonomy.
behaviors. So they were monarchies that were kind of caught in between. But to paraphrase the old saying, stuff flows downhill. So it meant that the people at the bottom of the economic structure were always the ones that were bearing the brunt of this. I mean, this is
Yeah.
true not just in the first millennium. This would be true in any society that's highly stratified and structured in the way that I think this society was. So while you have villages that are largely subsistence villages, we also then begin to see monarchic, what I would call industries. I mentioned wine presses, right? So,
Yeah.
we have these big, from Ashkelon, these big wine presses and other places that, and the lamelic handles on the jar handles make this very clear that the monarchies of Israel and later Judah were involved in wine production at an industrial scale, right? And so I think we can see that as a sort of industry that the monarchy is trying to utilize as a way of paying some of these tribute and taxes and so on and so forth. But I don't think that was ever sufficient to do what was necessary entirely. So those are some of the other economic activities. Obviously, farming, the raising of crops, cereal crops in particular, would have been part of this, and the production of olive oil. These would have been, some things that could have been used to support economic activities. And so you've got the monarchies that are also then imposing taxes on, Judahite and Israelite citizens, we'll call them, but then they themselves were having to pay taxes and tribute to their imperial
To the
overlords. So you've got, this really kind of structured, stratified economic society, and all of these layers, I'll call them, they don't nest on top of each other easily in every case. And so I think there's been a lot of work in social scientific modeling showing how these things coexist, but often they can be in competition with each other.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing. And it's one of the ways, just to come back to something that we said earlier, I think that's another way in which you see the prophets of the Hebrew Bible charting a course that's different from their ancient Near Eastern contemporaries. Because prophets who are speaking to the Assyrian king, the Babylonian king, they're not concerned with small agrarian farmers out in the hinterland for the most part. They're on the royal payroll, speaking in these royal sanctuaries and temples, and so they're operating at a very different level, speaking to um, a different echelon of society only exclusively. And
Mm.
I think in a prophet like Amos or even someone like Hosea, you see or Micah, you see these prophets who are dealing with monarchies, but are also they have a foot. They're almost more at home in these villages and smaller
Yeah.
societies in which they find themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find the way that you paint that picture both in your book and in this interview we're doing now is it's so helpful to actually situate us
Mhm.
in this world. And sometimes if we only speak in generalities, like, oh yeah, the poor, like sometimes
Right.
getting really specific, like here's how the economy worked, and here's all the things that were going in the
Mhm.
stratification of society. It really, I don't know, it really adds dimension to this, and we feel the weight all the more particularly that could be behind these oracles that we have preserved. I One thing I'd be curious about is if there's someone listening and they're like, "Man, wow, this is great."
Mhm.
I didn't really think about prophets as social legal critics. There's a lot of prophet books. If there's one that you would say start here, like this would be a great if you would just pick one of the prophets who really acted it in a particularly economic or legal critic sort of way, who would you kind of recommend? And can you maybe give us a little bit of description of what that looks like for this prophet specifically?
Yeah, I guess the two that sort of immediately jump to mind would be Amos and Micah, um, and I would say start there in large part because they're relatively short. They're not as long as Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Ezekiel, but Amos in particular, begins with this series of oracles aimed at economic behaviors of the little small countries surrounding Israel and Judah. And so that really does give you a great uh, glimpse in these relatively short oracles of how a prophetic book or a prophet like Amos thought about economic behaviors, not just for Judah, but also for Edom and Moab and the little places around them that lets you see that they've got this bigger sense of how economic structures and systems ought to work. And then that book transitions out from there and takes a more focused look at Israel in particular, the northern kingdom of Israel. And I like Amos because when you get to chapter 7, you have the one little narrative in the book where he goes into the state sanctuary there in the northern kingdom and denounces Jehoiakim. Jeroboam denounces
Yeah.
Jeroboam. Uh, and the little priest there says, again, I'm paraphrasing. Look, you don't get to come in here and offer these denunciations of royal policy. Go back to Judah and do your thing down there. But it's clear that behind all of that, there are some real economic policies that he feels a need to criticize, and he feels that the only way he can do this in this narrative that will get the attention of Jeroboam himself is to march right into the state sanctuary and say, again, I'm paraphrasing a bit, these policies you've enacted are immoral. Knock it off. And you can tell he hits home because he's shown the door, as we would say,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. So I think Amos is a nice one. Micah's a nice one because Micah raises a few issues. The book of Micah that I think even today we would say are issues that we have to be aware of in the intersection of politics and economics. And here I'm thinking of bribery, right? Micah has a couple of really interesting passages, chapter 3 in particular, where he really denounces prophets, priests, and officials who engage in sanctioned activities, whether those are religious cultic activities or prophetic activities or royal activities, but they do so by taking bribes. And
Mm.
for the prophets themselves, he says this is illicit economic activity. It
Yeah.
may be the case that prophets in other societies get paid, right? Maybe the Neo-Babylonian, Neo-Assyrian prophets are getting paid. But if you're requesting payment uh, and shaping your message such that it depends on the kind of payment you receive or not, then you have forfeited your right to be called a prophet. And he
Wow.
uses this term neshek, which is a term associated with the behavior of snakes, right?
Yeah.
So that it's like this sort of biting activity. So I've got a little discussion in there on that. But anyway, so I think Micah, in certain places, gives us a nice little window into those behaviors and concerns as well.
Thought
I
it
love your
was good.
comment on Micah. I also am fascinated by his particular word choice whenever
Yeah,
when he comments on their bribery, right? To use this word for snake biting, right? And
yeah,
imagining this prophet as this
yeah,
snake. Very, very,
yeah,
very powerful
yeah.
language.
It really is. Yeah.
One question I had reading your book, it was hard for me to not think about wisdom literature, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And in my final master's degree work, I focused on Proverbs 1 through 9. And
Mm-hmm.
there's some things I saw that maybe had a question for you that I was really curious about. If you see any sort of connection or unity between the prophets and the so-called wisdom literature, it's like
Mm-hmm.
Proverbs, Ben Sira, Book of Wisdom, in the aim of righteousness, justice, and fairness being a supreme goal. When I was researching Proverbs 1 through 9, one of the features that stood out to me is the centrality of
Mm-hmm.
righteousness, justice, and fairness to the aim of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And I was quickly reminded of this when I read in your book, for example, on page 146, you quote, one of the things you say is prophets were deeply committed to economic justice because they perceived that Yahweh demanded equity, fairness, and righteousness of Israel and Judah. Do you have any thoughts on the overlapping focus between the prophets and wisdom?
Mm.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So there is the old theory that some of the, a book like Isaiah and a prophet like Isaiah has his origins in wisdom circles. I don't know that many people would necessarily take that view today, in large part because I think sociological definitions of what wisdom circles were is sort of broken down. But you're right to point out that that the same kind of language shows up in both of these places, and I think part of what explains that is that the wisdom literature, and here I'm thinking particularly of Proverbs. So Proverbs
Mm.
and Isaiah, but we could also include the Torah in this. Understand that the kind of society that Yahweh has commissioned Israel and Judah to be is one that is ordered along these lines, that
Mm.
values things like righteousness, justice, to use my term, equity or fairness, and those sorts of things. Those may be too modern term, they may be a little too modern, but uh, you get the idea. I think there's a shared commitment to those. Now, do I think there may be a little variation in what each of them means somewhere along the way? Perhaps, but I think there are more similarities than differences between them.
Mm.
And I think a lot of that goes back to the association of those qualities with Yahweh himself in the Hebrew Bible, right? That these are qualities that mark not just the society, but they're qualities that
Yeah.
mark the society because they're qualities all of these authors, these individuals associate with Yahweh.
Mm. It's
That
good.
Yahweh is righteous. Yahweh is full of justice and mercy. I would add to that, and so on and so forth. And so I think in Proverbs 1 to 9, one of the ways that you see that is in these admonitions to to my son to make sure that you
Mm.
are uh, imbibing what this means, but then also growing up to be the kind of, I think Proverbs 1 to 9 is aimed at elite young males. So to be the kind of elite that establishes a society like that. So I think
Mm.
what you get then in the prophetic literature is the sort of relational side of that, which is when that doesn't happen, you get the prophets reminding my son that you're not living up to what you were being instructed to in Proverbs 1 to 9 in particular, right? That these are the sorts of things you ought to be doing. And so I often think of them as related in that way. That Proverbs 1 to 9
Mm.
is, this is how you were raised. as my grandmother used to say, you were raised a particular way. This is how you were raised. And then the prophets come along to say, yeah, this is how you were raised, and you seem to be forgetting what that means. So let's get with the program, right? And the program is one that is predicated on and founded on righteousness, justice, and care for those who you have a responsibility for.
Mm,
And so I think that's one of the ways in which you can think about how they're connected and related. Um, and that absent those qualities, you wind up with a society that, from the perspective, again, I think of Proverbs, is disordered and chaotic.
mm,
Uh, and for the prophets, the way they would talk about that disordered and chaotic society is that it is a prophet that is immoral. It's lost its moral
yeah.
footing.
Okay.
And I think those are two ways of talking about, for the biblical authors, the same thing.
Yeah.
And they both have similar kinds of consequences.
Yeah, that's really good. That
Very
makes
helpful.
such good sense to me. In fact, the way that my research originated was, at first I was going to do some intertextuality between the prophets and
Mhm.
Proverbs, and then it kind of dovetailed into something else. But it just became harder and harder to see this great divide between
Mhm.
Proverbs and the prophets. And I love the way you even depict it as, this is how you were raised, right? Your grandma,
Right.
your dad teaching you whatever, and then here come the
Yeah.
prophets along. Now that you're older, now that you're making decisions, these
Yeah.
villagers over here, man, like, I don't care that Assyria's breathing down your necks. What are you doing?
Right.
Like, come on,
That's
let's be
yeah.
right about it. But
That's
the
exactly
idea that they all come back to the same source, right? This is all pointing back to Yahweh, that who is the Lord, right?
right.
In his character. So that makes
Yeah.
good sense to me. It's really good.
And I think
Yeah.
that just one last thing about this. I
Yeah.
think seeing these kinds of connections is another way of reminding ourselves that it was a very small group of people composing this literature in
Mm,
ancient Israel and Judah. And so to think that they didn't know, that they were completely separated and didn't know what each
Mm,
other was talking
yeah.
about, or
Yeah.
the kind of theological positions they were taking, has always been hard for me to imagine. And
Mm,
I've done work in intertextuality as well. And so I don't mean to say that they're all doing intertextuality. I don't necessarily think that, but I do think there is a shared kind of theological outlook and commitment that allows for variation and difference, but shared nonetheless. And I think
yeah.
even in these traditions, you can see some of these shared traditions that in some sense give the Hebrew Bible the thing that unifies it,
Mm,
in those sorts of ways.
yeah, that's an interesting way to look at that. I mean, it makes
yeah,
me
that's
think
real
about.
helpful.
I heard one scholar use the phrase saying that much of the Bible is it's one really long minority report. That
Yeah,
like, we aren't to envision this as, yeah, this is like the dominant view that everybody's holding, and it's just this everybody talking like this. No, this is a minority report. This is not.
Mm,
Yeah, and it
yeah,
makes sense, like
yeah.
you said, this would be a very connected
yeah,
type
yeah,
of
yeah.
type
Yeah,
of
I mean,
view.
if you just think about literacy rates, right, in a society like Judah or a place like Jerusalem, you know, if we take the standard modeling for this, that's currently in view, you're talking about, a few hundred, a few, maybe 1,000 people who can actually write, and a smaller number of those who could actually compose literature like this, right?
Yeah.
Just because you could write doesn't mean you can write
Yeah.
Isaiah,
Right.
or you can write Exodus. So I mean, it's just, you could probably put all these people in the same auditorium, you know. So yeah,
What a
It's good.
conference that would be.
yeah,
That would be nice.
I've been loving our conversation. I'd love to shift gears one last time to just get a little more personal. And as you think about the prophets, your time spending with them, how does your research, whether it maybe impact the way that potentially we view Jesus and himself,
mm,
whether as
mm,
maybe a social critic, or maybe you just think about how did the prophets, how would you think about the prophets, understanding them in a holistic way, impact our personal lives as
mm,
Christians?
yeah,
Do you have any thoughts on maybe how this connects to Jesus or our lives today?
yeah. Yeah, so I think there's a very clear connection, I think, with Jesus. Again, I'm not a New Testament scholar by trade, but I know enough to be dangerous. And so one of the dominant regnant positions about the historical Jesus at the moment is that he was a sort of apocalyptic prophet. That's how Jesus thought of
Mm,
himself. And I think if you look at the way the New Testament authors portray Jesus, there's a lot in that that makes sense to me. And so what that means is I think you could think of Jesus as, in some sense, standing in this tradition, in this line, as a prophet who is, to use the phrase, speaking truth to power in ways that, somebody like Amos would have done. So that
Mm.
when Jesus, walks into the temple and overturns the tables, I think one analogy, they're not exactly the same, but one analogy for thinking about that is Amos walking into the shrine in Amos 7 and saying,
Yeah, good.
don't be this way. So that there is a kind of continuity of sorts
Mm.
between Jesus and Jesus. We've spent a lot of time talking about how prophets speak on behalf of small villagers and those in agrarian societies. I mean, that's where Jesus is coming from.
Yeah.
Galilee is very much an agrarian society. Um, and he knows fishermen, he knows farmers. These are the people that he knows. And so I think that's very much what Jesus is. And so when you look at the message of Jesus, I think he's very much picking up the same kinds of things you would see in somebody like Amos, Micah, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, so on and so forth. Even if they're not, quoting those prophets all the
Right.
time in the Gospels, I don't think you have to quote them to say Jesus is standing in that tradition. But then I also think, to your question about today, I think that ought to say to people of faith today that there's a key theme here about what it means to be a person of faith from within the biblical prophetic tradition. That the prophetic tradition requires us to be stalwarts for the kind of equity, fairness, justice, righteousness that one finds in these in the prophetic literature. And I always want to be very careful about that, because I don't mean to suggest that modern social values are the same as ancient biblical social
Yeah.
values. They're not. Although the Venn diagrams do overlap occasionally, they also occasionally don't overlap. So I don't want to collapse those two worlds too much. But I think there are lines of continuity that allow us to
Mm.
say, look, this is what it meant to be a prophet. This is what Jesus was getting at as someone who was speaking on behalf of God. And so that has to mean for Christian people of faith today something similar.
Mm.
And if it doesn't, I would gently say they've lost the plot. And so, particularly for Christians for whom the Bible is important, I think it's
Mm.
important to read it in a way that is not just simply, taking it for proof texts or little, getting little pellets of a verse here, a little verse there that you can, but to really grapple with the argument that these texts and these individuals are making. And
Mm.
and this is always my plea, even when I talk to people in churches. This is my plea for why developing an ability to think theologically is important for people in the pews,
Mm.
and not in superficial ways. Don't
Yeah.
be scared off by that.
It's
Um,
good.
be willing to grapple with things that are not easily grappled with and that make you and or other people uncomfortable, because that's what the prophets did, that's what Jesus did. And so if you're going to be part of that tradition, that might mean that's a door you ought to be willing to go through. And it doesn't mean punching down, it means, as the prophets did, punching up. And so I think, you know, I don't like to use violent imagery, but that's the way I'll
Cue the Rocky music. Let's just do that. Cue the
Yeah,
Rocky music
yeah,
right now. This is
yeah. You find the prophets and Jesus speaking on behalf of those who were not in a who were in a marginalized position.
Yeah.
And I think, at least for some today, I worry that part of the prophetic tradition is getting lost.
Mm.
You speak on behalf of those who really don't have a way to speak for themselves.
wow.
Mm.
What a powerful, challenging call to action. I'm ready to go. Like, let's show me the wall. Let's run through it together. Let's briefly wrap this up. First, I'll ask Dr. French if you have any last kind of thoughts or reflections on our conversation with Dr. Hibbard, and then Dr. Hibbard will end with you if there's any last thoughts you want to share with our audience today.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Hibbard, thank you for being with us. This book is excellent. I highly recommend it. I hope and look forward to the day that I can use it in a class on the prophets. It'll definitely be on the syllabus. So it's an excellent introduction to the phenomena of ancient prophecy in the Near East and in Israel and Judah. So thank you for writing this. It's really excellent.
Thank you. And thank you to the two of you. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for the stimulating questions, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Great. Well, we will leave links for the book and the show notes and description below for any of you that are interested. And we'll also leave a link to the university where he teaches at in case any of you are like, hey, I need to study with that guy. He makes me want to run through
Hey,
walls.
if you're in Southeast
theologically.
Michigan, come on.
Come on. Even though my family's originally from Ohio, so it took a lot for me to bring you on the podcast.
You're telling me that now and not at the beginning.
There's a reason I couldn't bring it up. I knew this wouldn't go well. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. We had a great time.
Thank you very much.